Remember when Brian Griffin was actually cool? Back when he was the voice of reason in a house full of chaos? Yeah, those days are long gone. Today, we're breaking down exactly when and why Family Guy's smartest character became its most insufferable. Brian was the cool dog in the early seasons of Family Guy. He was witty, well-read, and acted as the show's unlikely moral compass. Next to Peter's buffoonery and Stewie's chaos, Brian brought a dose of calm, grounded sarcasm. Fans loved him for being the intellectual oddball who also happened to chase tennis balls. But somewhere along the way, that charm started to sour. So, what happened? What turned Brian from a fan favorite to franchise frustration? Let's break down the biggest reasons fans went from saying, "That's our Brian," to, Brian again? 1. The Blind Side, Season 10, Episode 11. Brian meets Kate, a beautiful woman, at the club during disability night. There's just one problem. She's blind, and she hates dogs. Instead of being honest about what he is, Brian pretends to be human for weeks. He creates elaborate lies about his amazing sense of smell, makes up stories about being a war hero, and even disguises himself when meeting her parents. When Kate finally discovers the truth, she's devastated. Not because he's a dog, but because he built their entire relationship on a lie. She tells him she could have gotten over him being a dog, but she can't get over the deception. This episode perfectly shows Brian's willingness to manipulate vulnerable people for his romantic gain, making a clear turning point in how fans viewed his character. 2. Excellence in Broadcasting, Season 9, Episode 2. This episode starts with Brian getting a job at a conservative news station, which should have been comedy gold. Instead, it becomes a political lecture disguised as entertainment. Brian spends the episode arguing with Rush Limbaugh about conservative values, and at one point, he tries to waterboard Nancy Pelosi to prove his Republican credentials. The episode feels less like Family Guy humor and more like the writers using Brian as their political mouthpiece. Fans complained that Brian stopped being funny and started being preachy. Even Rush Limbaugh himself was reportedly appalled by some of the content. This marked the beginning of Brian's transformation from witty intellectual to insufferable soapbox speaker. 3. Brian writes a bestseller, Season 9, Episode 6. Brian's novel, Faster Than the Speed of Love, bombs spectacularly. So, out of spite, he writes a self-help book in 3 hours called Wish It, Want It, Do It. The book is literally just blank pages with prompts like, write down your dreams here, but it somehow becomes a bestseller. Instead of being embarrassed by the success of his garbage book, Brian lets the fame go to his head completely. He becomes insufferably arrogant, fires Stewie as his agent, and treats his best friend like dirt. When he gets invited on Bill Maher's show, Stewie tries to support him, but Brian literally tells him, "I'm done with you. Get out of here now." The public humiliation that follows should teach Brian a lesson, but his apology to Stewie feels hollow and self-centered. This episode crystallized everything wrong with Brian's character development. 4. 420, Season 7, Episode 12. This episode perfectly captures Brian's moral bankruptcy. After getting arrested for marijuana possession, Brian gives passionate speeches about how pot prohibition is unjust and based on corporate interests. He actually succeeds in getting Quahog to legalize marijuana, and the town becomes a better place for it. But then, Carter Pewterschmidt approaches Brian with a deal. Give an anti-marijuana speech to restore prohibition, and Carter will make Brian a best-selling author. Without hesitation, Brian abandons everything he claimed to believe in and gives the speech. The marijuana ban is restored, and Brian gets his book published. Of course, the book is universally panned and doesn't sell a single copy. Brian literally sacrificed his principles for nothing, showing fans that his convictions were never really that strong to begin with. 5. Friends of Peter G. Season 9, Episode 10, When Brian Hit Rock Bottom. Brian and Peter get arrested for sneaking alcohol into a movie theater and are court-ordered to attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. At the first meeting, Brian acts like a complete brat, calling everyone there boring old sticks and saying they could really use a drink. Instead of showing any growth or empathy for people struggling with addiction, Brian decides to help by bringing alcohol to the next meeting. He and Peter get the entire AA group drunk, turning a support meeting into a party. These are people who were trying to recover from addiction, and Brian actively sabotaged their sobriety because he couldn't handle being told he had a problem. When the police show up due to noise complaints, the group covers for Brian and Peter by singing Mr. Booze. This episode showed Brian at his most selfish, willingly destroying other people's recovery just to avoid taking responsibility for his actions. 6. Mom's the Word, Season 12, Episode 12. The moment Brian broke Stewie's spirit. In this episode, Brian commits what might be his worst offense, crushing a child's will to live. When Stewie asks Brian about what happens after death, instead of giving a comforting or age-appropriate answer, Brian launches into a brutal atheist lecture. He tells Stewie there's no afterlife and that we're all just bags of bones and flesh that eventually break down and decay into worm food. Stewie, being a baby despite his intelligence, becomes suicidal after this conversation. He tells Rupert that life is just a big joke and that he's just sitting around waiting to die. Brian's response to destroying a child's worldview? He shows zero remorse and continues to act like he's educating Stewie. This episode represents Brian at his most callous, prioritizing his own intellectual superiority over the emotional well-being of his best friend. Just when you think we've covered Brian's worst moments, we haven't even talked about the time he literally became suicidal over a bad Yelp review, or when he tried to sleep with underage girls. 7. Life of Brian, Season 12, Episode 6. The death stunt that backfired spectacularly. This episode killed Brian off in what seemed like a permanent way. He gets hit by a car while chasing a frisbee in the street. The death scene is surprisingly emotional, with Stewie holding Brian as he dies and the family genuinely mourning his loss. Social media exploded with outrage. Fans started petitions demanding Brian's return. Reddit threads went wild with theories about how he'd come back. The writers seemed to be testing whether fans still cared about Brian despite years of making him less likable. Then, just 2 episodes later in Christmas Sky, Brian returns via time travel, and it becomes clear the whole thing was a publicity stunt. Many fans felt manipulated, not because they were sad Brian died, but because the writers had used their emotions as a marketing tool. The stunt highlighted how disconnected the show had become from its audience's actual feelings about Brian. 8. The pattern that destroyed a character. Here's what makes Brian's fall from grace so frustrating. It wasn't just one bad episode. It was a consistent pattern across multiple seasons where Brian became increasingly selfish, hypocritical, and cruel. Early Brian from episodes like Brian in Love, Season 2, Episode 4, had real depth and vulnerability. He went to therapy, admitted his flaws, and genuinely tried to grow. But later Brian, he stopped learning from his mistakes. Whether he was manipulating blind women, sabotaging recovering alcoholics, or crushing children's spirits, Brian always found a way to justify his behavior. Fans didn't just hate what Brian did, they hated that he never seemed to understand why it was wrong. The character who once served as the show's moral center had become its biggest cautionary tale about unchecked ego and intellectual arrogance. So, do you still root for Brian, or did he lose you somewhere between the soapbox and the charity scam? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more animated deep dives every week. Brian might be the only dog who went from man's best friend to audience's biggest disappointment. But hey, at least he still knows how to pour a martini.